3 or 4 years ago, I began to do a study of the idea of authority from a kind of semi-philosophical, semi-historical, semi-sociological perspective. And one of the things I've been doing is going back over the idea of authority back to Socrates and then taking it forward through Roman sort of thinking, political thought, medieval sort of philosophy, all the way through the Reformation to the contemporary era. And as I was doing my work, I became very conscious of the fact that although this volume of the book is on authority, I had to do something also on freedom, because the authority-freedom couplet are so closely intertwined that you've got to understand the relation between the two as you're kind of going along. In the course of doing this work, as you would expect, you set out with certain assumptions, certain ideas of what it is that you're doing. But of course, when you're doing serious research, hopefully serious research, and you're doing the footnote work that Angus was talking about, you do come up with surprises. And you do find that all of a sudden, certain ideas creep up on you that catch you completely unaware, and you have to begin to rethink stuff. So my biggest revelation in the course of doing this work was actually the Reformation. Because I had always assumed, being a man of the Enlightenment, that the critical moment comes with the French Revolution, or the era around the French Revolution. And I'd always assumed that all the really interesting ideas coming to force in the 18th century and then subsequently in the 19th century. But then, having read a bit of medieval theology and then looking at the Reformation, you do begin to realize that if there was ever a moment in the development of Western intellectual thought and political theory and in Western culture that is really truly decisive in terms of the kind of processes that it unleashes, it is really the Reformation. It is that kind of moment where things are put in motion by people like Luther or Calvin, as well as a host of others. I mean, we often don't talk about Holland, where the Reformation is really important, where they are having a theological conversation with their predecessors. They begin to react against the papacy and the Catholic Church. And in the course of that, they begin to unleash a process that they never intended to do. I mean, that's what's very interesting about Luther, is almost everything that comes out of his writings, out of his actions, is really totally unexpected by him, and has got consequences that no doubt Luther himself would be horrified by if he were to know what happens because of the intellectual revolution, the religious revolution, that secular dynamic that is set in place at that particular time. So the first point to realize about the Reformation, which begins with the publication of Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, is that it had the effect of totally unsettling authority. In a sense, his defiance of the papacy, which led to the disintegration of a united Christianity, also provoked a major debate about where the locus of religious authority was, but also the relationship between the political and the religious. And one of the most important things that Luther said and did was he claimed that Christians could have a direct access to God without the need for any intermediary. And implicitly, by developing this notion of direct access to God, he basically sort of called into question the role of the clergy and of the church hierarchy. Moreover, through querying religious authority, what Luther also did, again unintentionally, was to open up a wider debate on obedience and resistance to political rule. It's really from Luther's time onwards that the issue of obedience begins to get politicized, requires a dynamic of its own, and where theories begin to develop, never happened before. Theories begin to develop, which we call resistance theories, which actually justify resistance to authority, something again that is totally new. Now in the 16th century, the political and religious spheres were so intertwined, they were so closely linked in Europe, that no reformation of religious could take place without also transforming the political. Totally unthinkable that you could have religious sort of reformation and change without touching the domain of the political. Now, it seems to me that one of the things that's important to realize is that until the 16th century, until Reformation, there's never been any precedent for directly questioning authority. And if you look at the experience of the Renaissance, humanism in the Renaissance, although implicitly they questioned papal authority, many of the humanist scholars, by upholding the idol of the Roman Empire, were questioning the authority of the Pope. There was no self-conscious attempt to question authority. It was something that was implicit. It's only through the Reformation that you begin to have the first explicit kind of dynamic being put in place. Now, of course, the Reformation did not set out to undermine authority, and it's unlikely that when Luther nailed his 95 theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, that he sought to fundamentally weaken the authority of the Church. At most, what Luther tried to do was to create a new locus for religious authority. And indeed, it could be argued that what the leaders of the Protestant churches wanted to do was to preserve ecclesiastical institutions, but in a more spiritual and moral form. In other words, Luther is principally motivated by spiritual concerns, an attempt to recast religious institutions in a form that's much more morally honest and, as he saw, much truer to the faith in its origin. However, through challenging the moral integrity of the Roman Catholic Church, he set in chain a series of events that would fundamentally lead to the questioning of all forms of authority, not just of the Catholic Church, but all forms of authority. Do I obey my conscience, the established religious creed, my government, or the larger claims of mankind, were the kind of queries raised by Luther and his actions. And he said, "Here I stand, so help me God, I can do no other." Right? Here I stand, so help me God, I can do no other. That's really how Luther responded to the demands that he recant his views at the Diet of Worms in April 1521. And his statement that he could do no other, but act in accordance with his conscience, gave voice to a sentiment that would eventually provide the legitimation for disobeying authority as such. And as the English historian Christopher Hill, who's done some wonderful stuff on the Civil War in particular, as Christopher Hill went on to say and insist, the essence of Protestantism, the priesthood of all believers, was logically a doctrine of individualist anarchy. Logically, the doctrine of individualist anarchy. Because once you set on that road, no matter what your reservations are, once you give an affirmation to the role of the individual conscience, you do begin to move in a very interesting, individually oriented direction. Writing more than 3 centuries after Luther's death, in a remarkable statement, Marx observed that in effect, Luther had shattered faith in authority. Luther had shattered faith in authority. And what Marx implied was that the sensitizing of European society to the sanctity of individual conscience would inevitably render problematic and unquestioned obedience to external authority. Hegel, in his formulation about the essence of Reformation, a very interesting passage in history, was that man, in his very nature, destined to be free, that idea of man in his very nature destined to be free, also drew attention to a very significant development. So the idea that individual conscience could stand in opposition to authority, or at least diverge from it, often led to the view that these principles were potentially or actually antithetical. That authority and freedom were no longer existing in a relationship of reconciliation with each other in the way that medieval theologians often saw it. Increasingly, the two principles were seen as polar opposite. Here is freedom, here's authority. The contradiction between the two. Something you and I often take for granted, but would have been unthinkable in the Middle Ages. It's very much a product of the Reformation. It's also important to recall that Luther did not set out consciously to widen the sphere of freedom. It's often believed that that's what Luther tried to do, but that really wasn't his intention. And in fact, if you look at the prevailing theological doctrines, what's really paradoxical is that Lutheranism, never mind Calvinism, is far more estranged from the idea of free will. It's far more deterministic than Catholic theology. If you look at the writings of Thomas of Aquinas or some of the other theologians of that time, you'll find that someone like Duns Scotus is far more hospitable to the idea of man having freedom of action in the religious domain than Luther ever was. So I think that's important to remember that the Catholic Church had a doctrine that man's nature, though corrupted by sin through Adam, innately strives for the good. That man's will is free to desire the good. That man's own effort is of avail for his salvation. And that by the sacraments of the Church, based on the merit of Christ's death, the sinner can be saved. So within Catholicism, for all its sins, there was a bit of freedom available, which, at least at the doctrinal level, Luther appears to close down by his doctrine of predestination. And we can debate whether he had an idea of single predestination or double predestination. I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to give you my particular kind of views on that. Because what's interesting about Luther is that in contrast to someone like Thomas of Aquinas, Luther is really emphasizing tremendously the powerlessness and the evil of man. So that man could not be saved by his own virtues. Salvation lay entirely, 110%, through faith in God. That was the only way forward. And indeed, in doctrinal terms, his sentiments were far more disposed towards determinism than some of his humanist critics. So if you look, for example, at Erasmus, writing at that time, in his tract on free choice of the will, it's a lovely little thing to look at, 1524. What he attempted to do was to you could see him finessing his way through the doctrine. He's trying to establish a bit of space, a modest role for the free will of man, attributing at least something to human choice, which has not been withdrawn from the grace of God. Luther responds by arguing for the denial of free will altogether and ascribing everything through God. And therefore, in his response, Luther, you can see, it's got a very interesting position because he sets in motion all these events, chain of events, which undermine authority. But at the same time, in his response to the Catholic Church, he's affirming the absence of free will. But at the same time, it's also important to remember, he's not being motivated by the impulse of putting forward some deterministic doctrine either. It's not the case that he sets out to be deterministic. That's really what his doctrine becomes. And in fact, what's interesting, and this is where Luther contradicts himself and begins to create a paradox that becomes more and more impossible to contain, is basically he says that, okay, no free will in relation to salvation, but underneath God, underneath everything else, in the domain of the secular, what is beneath him in terms of mundane activities of day-to-day life is perfectly willing to accede free will to men. That's what's important. He is perfectly relaxed and chilled out about allowing free will in terms of the mundane and the secular domains of human experience. It was only in matters pertaining to salvation or damnation that he totally denied it. When I say only, obviously that's a big deal in the 16th century. But there is a clear separation that is being built altogether. So we have this paradox. On the one hand, you have this doctrine of justification by faith alone in relation to salvation. At the same time, you have a far more openness to human agency in relation to the secular. So this is the paradox I want to spend a bit of time kind of exploring. It is indeed one of the paradoxes of history that someone like Luther, who was so devoted to the pursuit of Christian morality, actually contributed directly to what will eventually become the desacralization of authority. That's what's particularly interesting about him, because although he's unwavering in his pursuit of the truth, at times you find that although he's kind of questioning the authority of the church, he's also extremely violent and extremely energetic in his denunciation of heretics and rebels. In a sense, what he's really doing is he's both allowing a certain opening to individual conscience, whilst at the same time supporting the political rulers, of particularly the German princes, to control the behavior and to violently repress any form of contestation of authority. So basically what we have is a situation that's very paradoxical. But of course the other thing that occurs is that by attacking the papacy in such a consistent kind of a way, the papacy itself becomes much more defensive and begins to have to justify himself. I think that what's important about Luther is that by opening up the possibility whereby the external ruler couldn't really control the internal life of people, whereby he recognized that there was a separate sphere of individual conscience that was different to that of authority, what he really is doing is just creating the basis for the development of two parallel spheres. A parallel sphere that eventually will become a sphere of morality, which is to do with the internal conscience, with the internal life of people, and a sphere of secular politics, where politics and morality gradually will potentially begin to diverge from one another. And in a sense, the separation of external authority from the soul helped create the potential for the emergence of this parallel authority of the inner self away from politics. I think it's important to realize that once you begin to have a notion of inner self, that to some extent is seen to have its own justification. Once you begin to see that there's something within the human individual that has got some moral significance, it becomes more and more difficult for external forms of authority, external influences, to have the same degree of control and domination as was the case beforehand, at least in principle, if not in practice. And I think that that kind of tension between the two becomes very, very important. I mean, what Luther is doing in his writings, like his treatise on good works, for example, is basically saying that the power of the temporal authority, whether it does good or bad, cannot harm the soul. Basically saying that the soul is somehow protected from the misdeeds or the good works of the secular rulers. It's basically arguing that both to suggest that even though your soul cannot be harmed, you have to, by the bad works of a prince, you still have to obey him. So on the one hand, it's an argument for obeying secular rulers, regardless of whether they did right or wrong. But what is also done by separating the two is created the basis for potential tension, conflict, and resistance. the recognition of a sphere of freedom where political rule could not legitimately coerce the individual ultimately undermines absolutist authority, all of its form. And as Marcuse wrote in that little book of his, the inner freedom of the person must mean an internal weakening and breaking of authority relationship, however completely the individual may submit externally to earthly power. So no matter how pervasive the system of secular domination, its authority over the individual self was likely to diminish in the post-Reformation era. And Marcuse concluded by saying that the simultaneous recognition and transcendence of the whole system of earthly authorities announces a very important element in the Christian bourgeois doctrine of freedom, its anti-authoritarian character. And that's what's important here, is that regardless of the intent of the doctrine, in the very separation of the soul, the inner life from the external, you got this new dynamic being put in place, its anti-authoritarian possibilities. But the Reformation did not merely give rise to anti-authoritarian tendencies, because while it created the condition for the restraint of external power in people's in the inner life, it also sanctioned the use of unrestrained power in public life. That's the funny thing about Luther. I mean, basically saying, you can do whatever you're allowed to do whatever you want, rulers. I'm not going to justify, no matter how evil is your action, I'm not going to justify rebellion against you. That's what he's really saying. So on the one hand, he is justifying total coercion in the most unrestrained kind of a way, whilst at the same time, he's saying to people, no matter how bad your ruler is, be assured your soul is not going to be touched by it. And that's why what's interesting, and this is something that confuses historians, is that in the short run, the Reformation actually encourages absolutism. I mean, absolutism, in its political sense, is the immediate short-term legacy of the Reformation. What you have with Reformation is the disruption of the medieval formulas, where the universal church and its power was contained by feudal sort of political structure of checks and balances. That all goes completely. And the reason for that is because Luther's primary concern with the spiritual life of the individual and salvation means that the church ceases to be a countervailing power to political rule. Up to that point, in the medieval era, there's a balancing process that goes on between the church and the secular princes and various sort of political rates. That goes in the short run with Luther. So the effect in the short run was to atomize society, and as one historian says, render the individual naked before the state, without a strong institutional church to act as a check of the state. And I think what you find is that it's in this period of Reformation that with subsequent wars of religion, that you have an unusually violent historical moment which continually breeds a sort of very strong centralized form of rule. And many historians make the point that without Luther, there couldn't have been a Louis XIV. Louis XIV, French absolutism, all the rest of that, could not have come about without the intervention of Luther. So from the standpoint of the immediate experience, historical experience, Lutheranism is not so much defined by its anti-authoritarian impulse as by its opposite. During the past century, for example, Luther has been frequently caricatured as the historic ancestor of the modern authoritarian dictator. Back in 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, William Ralph Inge, the former Dean of London's St. Paul's Cathedral, wrote, "If we wish to find a scapegoat on whose shoulders we may lay the miseries which Germany has brought upon the world, I'm more and more convinced that the worst evil genius of that country is not Hitler, or Bismarck, or Frederick the Great, but Martin Luther. And if you read, for example, that's a religious, that's a kind of Anglican guy thing. But if you look at relatively the same time, and a German refugee, Erich Fromm, the man of the left, writes a book, Escape from Freedom, whose main attempt is to explain the fascist character, the German fascist character, as a direct product of the Lutheran Revolution. And Luther himself is then caricatured as like a medieval Hitler, having the same problem with mommy and daddy, revolting, sort of trying to sublimate their frustration, sort of on the, sort of the baby boomers of that generation. So in historical accounts, Luther, the authoritarian, competes with the image of a man who is responsible for the liberation of the inner man. And that kind of continues, more or less to the present day. How much time have I got? How much do you want? Famous last word. The legacy of the Reformation that is most usefully conceptualized as the positing of a contradictory relationship between the imperative of order and the aspiration for individual liberty. More specifically, through solidifying this contradictory relationship, freedom and authority would be increasingly interpreted as contrasting counterpoints to one another. And I think that what happens is that the pre-Reformation consensus, which regards authority as essential for the realization of freedom, now gives way to a new interpretation. One where increasingly a very different tension and conflict is put in place. And in many respects, with Reformation, the question of obedience turns into what will become the central problem for modern political theory. I'd like to spend a bit of time looking at the question of individual conscience. Now, in the 16th century, obedience to authority itself becomes an issue, since the supposition of an authority of individual conscience was logically put prior, and therefore it raised the idea of resistance as a permissible option. So although Luther adopted an authoritarian stance in relation to secular politics, he also contended that the papacy might be forcefully or forcibly resisted. Luther wrote that the church has no authority except to promote the greater good. He added that if any pope fought against reform, then we must resist that power with life and limb, and might and main. So gradually, because of this dissolving process, the idea of religious liberty begins to gain traction. And with the passing of time, the refusal to obey a corrupt church hierarchy hardened into a principled demand for freedom of individual conscience. Now, many of you today, living in the 21st century, find that not a big deal. And I remember I was in Belgium a couple of months ago, talking to some people there, PhD students. And they really couldn't understand, they couldn't get their head around why was it that I was talking about this novel development where obedience is now problematic. Why is this a big deal? And the reason for that is because if you're living in the 21st century, not obeying is not a big issue. We often self-consciously not obey. And obedience no longer has any inner moral content as such. Obedience is not something that we take that seriously. Even obedience to a parent, obedience to any kind of authority is seen as optional. It's something that can be negotiated. But I think it's important to realize that the moment where obedience is put into question represents a remarkable, unprecedented change in human relationship at all kinds of levels. It's something that is fundamentally novel and new. there really is no historical precedent for that in any civilization when that begins to occur. It's a fundamentally new concept. You know, you have had ideas of freedom before in the context of Greece or in Rome, and even in, you know, in the writings of the medieval churchmen. But the ideas of freedom are never about not obeying. Freedom and obedience are really coterminous in all of those ideas. So it's a very important development that we really need to sort of think about, sort of how that begins to occur. And although, as I said earlier on, in the short run, this occurs in a way that strengthens the power of secular ruler and leads to the rise of political absolutism at the same time. Nevertheless, what you have is this new world being created where absolutism exists alongside this yearning for freedom. One of the interesting things is if you look at doctrines of absolutism that were written to, for example, the doctrine of the divine right of kings, the divine right of monarchs, they really are very defensive. When you actually look at the philosophical justification for absolutist doctrine, they really do not carry the conviction that other doctrines had until that point. They don't have the same sort of conviction that, for example, the justification of papal infallibility had at an earlier stage. And it's interesting because, you know, if all you do is study history and you kind of read about the absolutist moment when these great kings of decentralized states emerged, you think, my God, they had a really sturdy set of ideas behind it. But actually, they don't last very long. In fact, the career of absolutist doctrines is very, very short. It unravels very, very fast. For the very simple reason that the rise of absolutism coincides with its contestation. You know, the very moment you have absolutism emerging, you have its contestation sort of being being kicked in place. In terms of my own work and my own thinking, what I'm really overwhelmed by when I look at the whole Reformation moment, what I find really quite interesting, because I think it's a problem that we have to this day, to the 21st century, is that one of the significant consequences of Luther's uncritical, even opportunistic advocacy of absolute rule, because you've got to understand that Luther was fairly opportunistic in this regard. I mean, he basically understood that the only way that he will be safe and secure is if he had some princes that watched his back. That was very, very clear. The only way he could get princes to watch his back is if he gave them permission to be secular princes with no restraints. And a lot of his political theory is really a pragmatic reaction to his insecure circumstances. But one of the significant consequences of Luther's uncritical advocacy of absolute political rule is that it helped erode the linkage between power of the ruler and morality. It's a very important point. It's really at that point that you have the breakdown of a concept, a very important concept in Western thought called authoritas, which comes from Latin, authoritas meaning a form of rule that combined moral authority with political power, but which in the medieval age was recycled through the parallel authority of church and the state. The only civilization in the world, and that's one of the most unique things about the West. You have parallel authorities, church, moral power, state political power being separate for a very, very long time, nowhere else. But everything about subsequent political theory has its kind of origins in relation to that. But nevertheless, you know, until that point, there's a very clear relationship. You know, political rulers aren't just simply people with strong arms and military might. They also have moral power. But that thing gets gradually disassociated. And that's hardly surprising given Luther's 1523 view on the proper function of government as repressive and punitive, repressing and punishing, and can be done, as he said, as well by those whose power is illegitimate as by those with legitimate power. So such instrumental attitude towards the use of coercion worked towards the separation of political authority from its religious validation. And indeed, the call for unqualified obedience to secular rulers made Christian ethic appear irrelevant to the logic of political order. And that's something that Christian theologians, as well as political figures who are motivated by Christianity, find almost impossible to reconcile. Because since the Reformation, the separation of Christian ethic and the logic of politics have existed in a very distant relationship, or an uneasy relationship with one another. And what Luther's writing did was basically create the dynamic that would make the two almost irreconcilable. Which is why if you look at most theological writings of the 20th century, for example, all the great Protestant Lutheran theologians, never mind the 19th century ones, they are very apolitical in one sense. They're not like, not like the Augustines or the old guys, sort of who are, political operators. There's a real distance between them for the very simple reason that the tension between moral authority and power becomes irresolvable. That's not what Luther intended. Luther would have wanted the opposite. But by, on the one hand, apologizing for uninhibited political coercion on the part of rulers, whilst at the same time creating this space for the soul, he did create an unbridgeable dynamic, a very creative one that we in the West particularly have to contend with and think about, because it takes different forms in different historical moments. But the final thing that's interesting for us in the 21st century is that because of the Reformation, you have the beginnings of a contestation for authority, for intellectual authority, which is intertwined, irredeemably intertwined with the whole yearning for freedom. The yearning for freedom and the contestation of intellectual authority is very, very important. As you will note, the religious disputes initiated by Luther went beyond the circle of professional theologians and had a big impact on the wider lay public. The claim by Luther and some of his allies, such as William Tyndale, that the authority of the Word and that of the Bible was absolute, called into question priestly monopoly over the interpretation of the Christian doctrine. From the perspective of the church hierarchy, you could no longer maintain your position as the sole interpreters of the Scriptures, since the laity were now authorized to interpret the Bible in their own way. And the opponents of Luther and Tyndale were not just simply concerned about protecting the status of the clergy, but they also feared that ordinary people, ordinary folk, were now allowed to interpret the Scripture for themselves. As far as they were concerned, if the Bible was translated into the vernacular, then the very integrity of this book would be potentially compromised. And I don't know if you had a chance to read the series of exchanges between Thomas More, another interesting guy, who initially was open to the idea. Initially was open to the idea of translating the Bible into the vernacular English. But when he began to think about it, he began to realize that it would stir up disputations rather than piety among ordinary people, and therefore became a bitter foe. The Catholic Church certainly realized the challenge posed by and the destabilizing consequences if common people had direct access to the vernacular Bible. And in the theological dispute that followed, there was some very interesting discussion about what was more important. And I think it's at this point that you have, on the one hand, the Protestants saying that the most important was the Bible, and that's it. And the Catholic Church, to put it simply, are saying that what's important is tradition and experience. And you cannot simply reduce that to the book. But the Church says, more in particular, that the inspiration of custom and oral tradition is important. As More said it, Christ had spoken and done far more things that had been written down. I think that debate between Thomas More and Luther, but it was a wider debate that involved a number of humanists and Catholics on the one side and Protestants on the other, is actually worth revisiting even now, because it hasn't really been studied from what I would say a kind of modern sociological point of view. It's a very rich discussion, which is really about, what is the focus for intellectual authority? I mean, how do you determine the pursuit of the truth? How do you truth seek? How do you go about sort of engaging with that? What do you use as the signpost in relation to that? That debate, that discussion, very much kind of comes back from that. The bypassing of the professional clergy, the involvement of a public in these debates is hugely, hugely important. And as Christopher Hill, who I mentioned earlier on, argued, the Bible proved a time bomb, which humbler Protestants could use against their betters. It's a time bomb. Once you get the Bible in your hands, once ordinary people get the Bible in their hands, once they have the potential for interpreting the Bible in accordance with their own experiences, then of course everything is put to question. And we know that because since the Reformation, a number of texts, when assimilated by everyday experience, have consequences which are very, very different than could have been anticipated early on. The great thing about the Bible, as with the printing of books, is that it makes it impossible, it makes it very, very difficult for ideas to be policed in the usual way. You can have censors, you could have police kind of keeping an eye, you can have spies listening to what people preach in a church, but it's very difficult to totally police the printed word. And I think that's a very important legacy of that experience. So basically, just to conclude, I would say that ideas about the right to resist despotic authority converge with those of freedom of the inner person and the acknowledgement of consent as a source of sovereignty to forge a cultural sensibility towards the valuation of the authority of the self. That's what we get out of the Reformation. To make a long story short, if everything I said was completely incomprehensible, as my friends always say, then at least one point to kind of get out of it is that through the separation of the inner person from external authority and the creation of this new space for individual conscience, what you gradually begin to have is the emergence of the idea of individual freedom. It happens very hesitating. In history, things develop by tiptoe. People tiptoe around and they avoid, they kind of move back. But it happens nevertheless. And what you have gradually, through the valuation of the authority of the self, a trend that becomes harder and harder to ignore, that becomes more and more clear by the 18th century, certainly by the very late 17th, early 18th century, where you gradually begin to have a more modern rendition of the distinction between subject and object, where the old ideas about subjectivity and objectivity are reconceptualized in terms of the inner life of people and the external impediment to the realization of some of those elements. And in a sense, what you have as well is an important reorientation towards psychology, where through the inner experience of people, you have a fundamental blow to authority, since it freed the inward-oriented individual from duty to external rule. So in a sense, just to kind of finish with one final point, the freeing of the inner person from the power of external authority provides the foundation for the development of individual conscience. And Luther, his own doctrine of single predestination notwithstanding, provides the basis, a point of departure for greater clarity about the individual to take responsibility for destiny. I think what's very interesting here as a sociologist is that what you have is this historical process of mutation where the attempt to challenge the church in a very narrow domain calls into question the possibility of there being a universal church that is speaking to everybody. It puts in motion a very limited idea of individual freedom, a very limited one. I mean, it's a crack, it's a small crack, sort of, but a small crack that lets in the light and allows people to then begin to take their own agency a teeny bit more seriously. And with the passing of time, what is seen as being freedom in relation to matters of conscience hardens into a more modern idea of freedom as being about liberty, as the capacity to exert agency. It also, unfortunately, in the 21st century, it's not something we're going to discuss this week, also mutates into the therapeutic self. And all the bollocks you hear about your issues and your internal problems and the various syndromes and everything else that we have in relation to that are also some of the unfortunate side effects of this. But nevertheless, there is put in place a future-oriented, agency-related form of subjectivity, which will at times have a transformative imagination, and at other time will end up stuck inside of us. That's the modern world that we live in. Thank you.
Okay, we started a bit early, so we still have most of an hour for discussion. I have a couple of questions, but I'll come straight to the audience to give you a chance to... can I see a show of hands if you'd like to speak? Now, we don't have spiritual intermediaries to hand out microphones, so I'm going to have to ask the congregation to pass it among yourselves. Heidi, could you get us started by giving that to... Yep.
Yeah, Johnny Morris. I thought it was very interesting, actually, Frank. The question. I'll just stand up and shout.
No, turn it on.
No, please switch it on.
Hello.
Hey! Yeah, Johnny Morris. Yeah, thanks, Frank. That's really interesting. I just think I'd like to hear a bit more, if you could, on the sort of social and political context in which this took place. Because there have been previously, there's been a series of schisms and like the Janicists and all the rest of them, and presumably lots of priests have fallen foul of the church and probably just got burned at the stake and never heard of them again. So I'd just like, just perhaps you could just expand on why, as you say, this particular, why Martin Luther, this particular historical context, why his ideas were then picked up and further developed, especially in the context of the growing mercantile capitalism of Northern Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I should have, I didn't go into any of the historical detail, but I think the way to conceptualize what's happening at the time of the Reformation is that Reformation is preceded by a 200-300 year period within which the medieval formula, the relationship between the papacy and its claims to universal rule. The papacy isn't just a religious institution, it's got very strong secular political ambitions. And the Roman Empire, which is like a very weak, sort of notional institution, primarily sort of run by German princes and kings, are at odds with each other. And there's within that context, there are periodically movements which demand the reformation of the church, which demand that the papacy, which is a relatively corrupt secular institution, clean up its house and orders. And there's a very important movement that exists before this called the conciliar movement, where within the Catholic Church there's an attempt to hold the Pope to account to a wider, sort of, I suppose, a wider kind of democratic forum, which in a sense is bit premature. It doesn't really kind of get its act together. But what happens, luckily for Luther and for the Reformation, is that precisely at the time when Luther comes into play, you also have the beginnings of the creation of what will become the nation state. Gradually, you have, for example, in France, the centralization of political authority. You have, for example, in England, with the Tudor moment, a far greater emphasis on state building. And until Henry VIII, we always say about Henry VIII, but the interesting things happened before Henry VIII. You have a lot of tension between the church and the political rule, which is really a question of who's going to be the ultimate authority within England itself. And I think that the important thing that happens is that precisely the moment at which the Reformation becomes important and Luther raises those issues, you also have the potential tension exploding between secular rulers and the Catholic Church. And secular rulers will be very opportunistic as to which side they will be on. This will be a very fluid sort of movement, kind of back and forth. But because there is now potentially political state support for a dissident religion, it means that Lutheranism can survive. Lutheranism can, as can Calvinism later on, by getting the backing of certain sort of secular leaders. One interesting point I should have mentioned, which is that, as you know, formally, Luther's protest is against the corruption of the church, the sales of indulgences, for example, which he really objects to. And I think that's interesting. It's something, again, from a sociological point of view, I find really fascinating, because the sale of indulgences was about selling these trinkets to people who committed a sin, and who felt that if you bought those trinkets, those indulgences, you could be saved, which is why you paid a lot of money for those things. But actually, when you think about it, I mean, what is going on there in modern terms when you buy those, you know, it is not just simply an early form of therapy. You know, here's the trinket, sort of, and all the rest of that. But also, what's very interesting about it, and this is something that I only picked up on when I looked at it in a little bit more detail, is that assumes an incredible degree of freedom. It means your destiny can be changed. I mean, otherwise, why would you pay that money? You know, if you were damned because you committed a sin, but now you could be saved by buying it, right? It shows you that, in fact, within the Catholic Church, as corrupt as it was, you know, as corrupt as that practice was, there was this assumption of far greater freedom for the individual than Luther, who tried to get rid of the custom. Interesting kind of sideline for the whole thing.
Okay, I'll take a few before I let Frank back again. Kerry, got the mic now.
Yeah, Kerry Bingle. My question was actually a very similar one on just understanding what it is about that moment that gives rise to Luther, but you've covered it really. But I did just want to ask in relation to that from the three books. I argued this with Dolan when I saw the first reading. What was it about the from that why did you read that? I kind of got an understanding from the Skinner and the Marcuse and what you've just said, which brought it all together really well, that there is something about psychology in its early emergence that is actually quite important in terms of freedom, in what it attributes to our capacity, yet it becomes so the psychobabble, which is wholly deterministic. And then when you read the From on Luther, and you think, oh, whether it's the monastic experience of his childhood, I got really angry that we were reading this deterministic rubbish. So what is important about that?
Okay, can you pass it behind?
Richard Swan. Yeah, Frank, I agree with everything about what you're saying about the way that the Reformation is pivotal and that it allows, legitimises this question of obedience. But the one thing I did want to pick up, you said there's no self-conscious attempt to question authority before it. And I immediately go back to Chaucer's wife, Bath, who says, you know, experience though there were non authoritae in this world, were rich enough for me. She says, experience is enough, and the whole of the life of Bath is exactly about a direct, self-conscious challenge to authority and setting up personal experience as the alternative. Now that's back in sort of 1380, and if Chaucer's writing about it at that stage, unless he's a freak, it must have been part of a process which was already taking place quite radically. And Chaucer also obviously writes about the pardon and about indulgences and so on. And to me, Martin Luther is the culmination of a process. It's a bit, I think, following on from what Johnny was saying, it seems to me the culmination of processes that had been taking place for maybe 200-300 years, rather than something that emerges new. Still pivotal. Yeah.
Can you just the man behind you and then Phil Miller to the side?
Just a quick question is, we remember now at the moment, but I wonder what Mohammed would have to say about what Furedi's said.
Mohammed, the Prophet. Yeah, back to your side. Angus, could you take that mic to Dominic? This.
Thanks, Phil Mullen. A little bit more on the paradox of Luther, which may perhaps answer the question as to why he individually was so pivotal. And I may have missed your entire point, but my intuition is that it's the paradoxical thing about free will and his stance on that, which seems antithetical to what went before in Erasmus and Thomism and so on. The contrast of that with his what leads to individual conscience. Is that paradox an inevitable aspect of Luther's influence, or could you have had a non-paradoxical view? Did he have to be so strong on the question of free will and seemingly go against the more progressive views of reconciling reason and faith?
Okay, thanks, Dominic. And then there's a guy there, and then I'll let Frank respond.
You hear me? Yeah, your initial comments, Frank, that there was no wide questioning of authority for the Reformation. I was thinking not so much in terms of Chaucer as being an exception to this, but of the Venetian Republic being an exception to this. A few points, which is not advertising, but we know that the Venetian Republic was excommunicated from the Vatican in 1284, 1309, 1483, and 1606. And did seem to play quite an important role both in Reformation thought and in counter-Reformation thought. And I'm interested in your kind of discussion of authority and the separation of authority in terms of the secular authorities and the religious authorities. Because in the Venetian Republic, before the Reformation, the Doge, the princely figure who ruled Venice, received his authority directly from God via St. Mark in St. Mark's Chapel, which was St. Mark's Church, which was the Doge's private chapel, and the separation between that and the Catholic Church's cathedral, which was kind of down Back Street in Venice and was often neglected. And there seemed to be that kind of separation of authority between the secular world and the religious world, which was one of the sources of conflict between Venice and the Catholic Church. And then if we look at some of the counter-Reformation thinkers, like Jean Baudin, he led a very kind of strong polemic against the mixed government in Venice as he moved towards absolutism, because Venice evolved the system based on the Doge representing the monarchy, the Senate representing aristocracy, and democracy representing the Great Council by magistrates voting on behalf of the populace. Now, that voting system was in place by 1297, and obviously it wasn't universal suffrage. There were probably only about 10% of Venetians who were involved in voting. But that does in some ways represent a very early and quite exceptional development of democracy and free will, long long before the Reformation. And just to give you a kind of short illustration,
Quick as you can.
it was invented, the secret ballot was invented, and a ballot is actually Phoenician dialect for a small ball, because they started putting small balls in bags to vote for people. So there are many ways in which I think the Phoenician Republic represented a wider questioning of authority, and maybe also a separation of secular authority and religious authority.
Thanks. The guy with the microphone.
Hello, Darren. Just being pedantic a bit, I think Frank's explanation of indulgences was a bit misleading. The point was that you were already saying, although you were buying off into your time of COVID, so you were preventing yourself from suffering COVID. You weren't saving yourself from damnation per se. So you were just shortening your time of COVID, which everyone has to suffer through because it's already committed life. So that's the pedantic point. And second, equally, the pedantic point is that Luther didn't actually say, here I stand, I can do no other. He should have done, but he didn't, which is unfortunate because it's a really good line. And the third thing I want to say is that, in some ways, I think Frank's very much pointing out the epoch-making nature of Luther's contribution. But in a way, it's also important to see that the seeds of this revolution were planted very, very long ago. And I think it was the sort of D.B. Warfield who said that the Reformation was actually based in the mind of the long-dead Saint Augustine, in between Augustine's concept of the church and Augustine's concept of grace, or free will, for the matter. So I think that's quite interesting. And the last one I want to say, actually, it's interesting that you brought up Dennis, because the sort of uncomplicated, non-paradoxical way of having desacralized political authority is actually the sort of Republican humanist contribution, which I think Frank sort of played down to the Renaissance. And that is a less problematic way of conceiving of political authority without resorting to that sort of strange authoritarian, the sort of strange dialectic between authoritarianism and the authoritarianism. And the Republican strand appears in the American Revolution, as John Pocock taught us so long ago. So yeah.
Okay, I'll let Frank respond before I let Alan Hutchison. Just one thing to test you on. A couple of people have questioned the novelty of what Luther was doing. But also on the indulgences thing, I just wanted to push you a little bit on the freedom thing, because there's no obvious correlation between a theological or philosophical position on free will and political. And the thing about the indulgences, or the church in general, the emphasis on works, that you have to do good works to earn salvation or time off from purgatory, against it purely being on faith, meant that was mediated through the church. So the church gets to decide what good works are. They get to sell you the indulgences, so that there's a coercion that the church has to guide free will. Whereas once you've got that, there's a kind of liberation from that. If you're saying works don't matter, you're either saved or you're not, then that seems to also offer a kind of a form of freedom. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Right. You? All right. Well, thank you for testing me. I thought I had kind of gone beyond that 60 years ago. The big question that people are asking is the moment, sort of, and of course, sort of, when I say that this is the moment, that doesn't imply that somehow out of some space, Luther lands in Europe, completely out of context and detached from previous historical experience. Because if you go back, and you could go back all the way to Greece, ancient Greece, you will find there are particular moments in history where the aspiration for freedom gains certain intellectual definition. And you can see that there are glimmerings, important advances occurring, which for a number of reasons may well get suspended for a particular period of time. I think that, nevertheless, that there are some changes that are qualitative, at point at which those earlier trends acquire an independent moment. Now, if you take, for example, people talked about the Renaissance. It's an interesting period, the Renaissance, because in many respects, if you, as an individual, I find it much easier to relate to Petrarch, you know, and the literature of the Renaissance. I'm much more comfortable and identify much more than reading Luther. I mean, Luther to me is like hard work, whereas the Renaissance, you know, are raising very important ideals. But, you know, in the Renaissance, what they were doing was, in a sense, going backwards. I mean, Renaissance means a kind of rebirth, but the models that the Renaissance were using, the thinkers, was potentially to recapture the ideals of the Roman Empire, of antiquities. Now, of course, they were reinterpreting it as well, and they were questioning some of the old ways in which the previous texts were kind of given meaning. But by and large, the model that they had was the universalism of the Roman Empire, which they were counterposing to the universalist demands of the Catholic Church. And in the course of doing that, obviously, political conflicts occur. But if you actually look at the example of Venice, it proves my point very, very clearly, because if you look at the political system that's established there, as you were saying, Dominic, the Doge is appointed by God. And strictly speaking, the Doge is not a political ruler, as opposed to a religious ruler. He's both. And that's the thing about the rebels against the church at that point. All the rulers who are, they're not saying, I leave religion to you, and I'm just a secular political leader. What's interesting is that as part and parcel of the gradual rebellion against the papacy, there are all these monarchs who spend all their time writing religious texts. I mean, Henry VIII, right? He doesn't just simply go after ladies, you know, sort of. He goes and writes this incredible, you know, response to Luther, you know, sort of. And there are all these other theological writings because they realize that if you're going to be a monarch of a nation state, you've got to establish your theological credentials as much as anything else. So if you look at, you know, for example, it's interesting. There is a custom that evolves in Europe at that time, it's part and parcel of absolutism, which is called the royal touch. I don't know if you heard about the royal touch, but basically means that because you as a ruler are divinely appointed, you know, you periodically go out and you touch people with diseases. I forget what it's called, begins with the SC, I can never pronounce it. That's right, yeah. You kind of touch these people, and they're going to get cured, you know, sort of. And all those symbols of semi-divinity, of religion, it becomes part and parcel of that. So what I'm really trying to get at is that there really isn't the kind of defiance, the self-conscious explicit defiance of authority. What there is a questioning of specific forms of authority, but not questioning the fundamental assumptions on which that authority was based. Just to say, I am God, you know, I live by God's, you know, sort of grace rather than you. I think that's really where it goes. And the wife of Bath example, I think, is really remarkably interesting. I don't know who reads that question. It's a really interesting example because it's in literature. You know, in the early medieval literature, which is, again, you know, our students don't study anymore, where you find a lot of this, you know, questioning occurring in a way that is completely unconscious. It's almost like, which is often the case, that often it's in literature that you find the first glimmer of defiance, of, you know, what the hell, you know, why is this happening? Where people assert things almost unthinkingly, and that's captured by the playwright or the author. I think you're right. I think in Chaucer there are many very rich nuggets of insights about the human condition, which are just there, you know, sort of, which will later on become, you know, acceptable, you know, but it's there already. But there's a difference between Chaucer's wife of Bath saying those things, and people going, you know, sort of out and putting themselves on the line to kind of, you know, sort of define what's really kind of going on there. And I think that's, in that sense, what I meant. I haven't got time to answer all the questions, but there's one point I want to raise, which is what Fromm and Erickson. I think you were talking about Erickson,
yes,
rather than Fromm. And I think the reason why I really wanted that to be put on is because one of the prejudices of our time, if you teach social sciences in universities, or if you accept some of the conventional truths of academia today, there is a very powerful impulse, that's developed whereby it's really cool to make fun of religion on the wrong kind of basis. Religion, they're fundamentalists, they're idiots, they're schmucks, they're screwed up people, and all the rest of that. And this idea of stigmatizing religion is just as bad as the way that religious people stigmatized humanists and atheists. It's really the mirror image of that. Really develops within that Germanic psychological theories. The Frankfurt School is really one of the most important, what's called critical theory, is this where it kind of really kicks in, where you've got this, kind of second-hand Freudianism being applied to rewrite history. And of course, I know all of us from our experience, whenever we don't like anybody, we can always say something smart like, well, it must be the mom or the dad, or kind of something that, sort of some kind of psychological reason. And I think that's that, and it's really, really important, because Fromm's Escape from Freedom is a phenomenally sophisticated work compared to the crap you're getting now. Some of the stuff that's been written in America about human behavior, about religious people, about right-wing people, all the rest of that, the psychologizing of behavior is far more crude than, at least Fromm actually studied Freud. He actually sort of looked at psychoanalysis, whereas these ones basically did, psychology 101, sort of at Vermont College, and kind of go away and write a book about it. I agree about your point at this point. And I agree about the fact that Luther didn't actually say that word for word, but I'm taking poetic license here.
Who's going to get the microphone? Could you pass it to the front? Alan Hudson.
Okay, Alan Hudson. Very briefly on the indulgence question, the Catholic Church changed its position on the question of indulgences in the first half of the 1400s from what you outlined to what Frank outlined. They moved beyond the fact that indulgence was years of purgatory to the fact that you got rid of sin completely. That's what Luther particularly objected to. Similar to their change on the question of usury to account for mercantile capital. I won't repeat the points that Frank made to concur with him. The way I would look at the role of the Venetian Republic is that the papacy was using its religious authority to support its secular position, and the Venetian Republic was excommunicated in the main because of its aspirations to control the Romagna, which was traditionally papal territory. And the papacy had the same attitude towards the Florentine Republic and also to several of the other emerging nation states. And I think, to just elaborate a little on what Frank said, is that the issue with the Renaissance and the rediscovery of classical learning was that they were unable to substitute church authority. They had to find a way of reconciling church authority with the authority of the ancients, and they continued to be able to do that for some time until their own intellectual investigation started to unearth classical texts which contradicted each other, so that they were unable to preserve the idea of universality that had been maintained by the Thomists in relationship to particularly Aristotle and Plato. And the key to this moment, which I think is worth investigating at some other time, is the rediscovery of Lucretius on the nature of things in the early 1400s, which opened up a whole Pandora's box of the possibility of free will through the use of atomic theory. And very briefly, although I still am trying to work this through myself, and hopefully this weekend will help, I think, to answer Phil's point, that's why the Protestant Reformation had to so definitely re-emphasise much more vigorously than the Catholic Church the question of predestination, was because more contemporary, modern and more scientific and empirical traditions were actually emphasising the fact that the nature of the world, the material world, made the possibility of of it being all divine order much more problematic. This is in fact the real reason, I think, for the taking of Galileo. The traditional story of Galileo is it's against the Copernican universe, but in fact recent documents have shown that the Catholic Church was much more worried about the attack on transubstantiation, the relationship to matter. So I think that is the paradox, is that the movement away from the authority of the papal church necessarily reinforces a rather anti-intellectual move in the early Protestant churches. And very finally, just on this question that relates to the indulgence question, is that the German princes, like many other European lords, had already started taking church land in the way that Henry VIII did, which made it even more important for the papacy to use indulgences, so they became more frenetic about it. And it was at this point in time, towards the end of the 15th century, early 16th century, where the financial position of the papacy became much more threatened, and they became even more rapacious than they had been in the past. I think the points, finally, sorry, on the question of the alternative traditions of the poor, I think one of the reasons we associate it particularly with playwrights is because that's the only evidence of the life of the vast majority of people. Although there is other evidence, as a small tradition of hostility to received wisdom. If you, for example, look at Ginsberg's book on the cheese and the worms and the taking of the miller to in front of the Inquisition twice, is that common sense is a factor in most human experience, although it didn't pay to talk about it, because after they let him off once, they burnt him the second time.
Okay, thanks. I think there's 3 people over here. And could you pass that down to someone other hand? Yeah, thanks.
I have a question about the way that you describe how Luther developed the idea of the inner person, and which then goes on to develop the idea of sort of individual consciousness. Because when you look at the Reformation, it takes Europe by storm. It seems like, you know, it kind of unravels so much so quickly. So presumably that notion of sort of the inner self, the internal voice, the sense of personal authority, must have kind of had some purchase within society. And I'm just wondering where that idea, what creates that idea in medieval society? I mean, there is a notion of the soul before then, but what is it about that particular moment in history that allows that certain sense of an inner self encounter to external authority really developing at that time?
Okay, thanks. Would you pass that behind you?
My question is on tradition, I think, because Frank, you say, well, the debate comes about what is most important, the Bible or tradition, what is the focus for intellectual authority, and how do you determine the pursuit of the truth. And I think then you're saying actually what happens is the Bible becomes that wins out against tradition and you know, good things that creates an idea of individual agency, a modern idea of freedom brings in the whole notion of liberty. But I guess what happens to tradition then? In a sense, does it mean it has entirely been defeated in a way? Things that then seem to be traditional actually are still within the individual sense rather than the traditional sense. And I guess in that sense, I mean, some of the arguments that are happening at the moment, for example, the arguments about marriage or the arguments about circumcision, in which politically some people are arguing we still must, tradition trumps over, you know, we're trying to win some arguments around looking at tradition, but can we, and has it, you know, is there any call for it? Is there any way it can be helped with the pursuit of knowledge, or has the individual won?
Okay, in front, the 2 more, and then I'll take the third back.
Yes, if we look at the powers today, it seems that the idea of the power grab, the fact that almost Luther was put up to it by the German princes perhaps, seems to be quite a dominant force, because if you look at how it sort of ended up playing out in England, you do not have a sort of independent spiritual, you know, church that's full of individuals doing their own thing directly to God, and then separate from that the political state. You have the Queen here as head of state and head of the Church of England. And it is very interesting how it sort of came together in the church. So it was a power grab by the British state and the monarchy over the church against the primacy of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church. So you had Queen Elizabeth I going around asserting this new kind of, not divinity, the sort of divine right of kings, because then she just looked like the Roman Catholic Pope. She had to do a kind of divine light, if you like, look. So she had portraits painted of herself looking like a religious figure, but with her foot on a map of England. And that's very sort of interesting how with today, the present Queen is sort of quite saint-like, really, in her going around with her sort of nice white skin and always these photo opportunities, always looking sort of serene. And interesting, I've just interviewed someone from the Roman Catholic Church who paints themselves as this great radical because they're not part of the official state church today, which is obviously born from Protestantism, who are very much part of the state, not completely separate from the political state.
Okay, can you pass it in front?
It's okay.
Okay, great. I think it was a Heidegger scholar at the back. Yeah.
You spoke a bit about the relationship between Luther and Aquinas, and Luther was really scathing about the prospect and the possibilities of natural theology. And moving away from that tradition, he tried to turn towards the subject as a way of connecting with God on a more individual level. And I just wondered if you could say something about whether you believe there's a relationship between his attempt to do that and Descartes' attempt in the Meditations to also turn towards the subject as a means of rationally arguing for the existence of God in the tradition of the Catholic Church and in line with natural theology, in fact reviving the ontological argument through the process of beginning with the self and the ego.
Okay, would you pass it to Alan Miller next to you?
The relationship you point out between absolutism existing alongside a yearning for freedom, I'm wondering about how this tiptoeing of these ideas interplay a bit more with the question at the front about the emergence and the development of mercantilism and the relationship of the individual. Because you have princes and kings who are seizing these ideas in an attempt to continue control. But we haven't really discussed that much, not to be overly mechanical, but how the relationship expands with this new emerging group that takes these ideas that begin to be able to be separated and then runs with them, and just how that it plays out a little bit more. I mean, because if you look at something like Chaucer and the Pardoner, that is mocking in terms of the irony of the idea of pardon going out and pig's feet and stuff like that, whereas someone later, like Shakespeare, doubts authority in a more complex way. But I'm wondering a bit more how the relationship between the new emerging class actually impacts that and takes it further.
Okay, Frank. I'll take one more round of questions after Frank's spoken.
Well, I think that there already is a precondition for this being laid. We already see signs of this in the Renaissance, this kind of the a growing aspiration towards individually related kind of activities, particularly in the Italian city-states, but also in Holland. And so, and I think if you look at the humanist flourishing in places like Rotterdam and Amsterdam and elsewhere, you can see that there is a kind of a fertile terrain for this. And I think it's not accidental that all these developments occur in places that are involved in overseas trade. Overseas trade involves greater sensitization to different cultures, different ways of, different social and other kinds of arrangements. This is also the time when there is a growing, the beginnings of an agrarian revolution taking place in many parts of Europe, where feudal relations are themselves sort of compromised by attempts to create much larger centralized political units. So that the whole of Europe, to some extent, is changing quite rapidly. It's kind of creating the conditions which will eventually become known as industrialization, capitalism, and all the rest of it. And I think urbanization, very important. Geneva and Calvin, obviously there's a kind of a link there. If you look at where the Huguenots sort of emerge in Europe, Huguenots don't live in the massive centrale. They're in the ports, of France. The first countries to, sort of become to kind of go to the Reformation after Germany and England, Denmark, Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, they're all, you know, sort of the kind of places that you would expect, right? It's not Andalusia, a place like that, you know, sort of for, by that kind of obvious kinds of reasons. And I think that's really sort of kind of quite important. Now, in terms of tradition, I really think that with Reformation you have the death of tradition. That's it. You know, I mean, from that point onwards, tradition will be on the defensive. And what you have is the displacement of tradition by traditionalism, which is the politicization of tradition, because from that point onwards, tradition needs to be justified. But you see, tradition, if it's not justified in its own terms, as taken for granted, in other words, if tradition is not justified traditionally, it becomes something different, it becomes traditionalism. And that's the problem that religion has, but also other movements have had ever since that point onwards, where you try to find rationalized ways of justifying tradition. It's good. You know, a circumcision debate, you get Jewish guys saying it's good for health, you know, not because the Talmud says, or not because somebody else says. So you have this kind of very important shift occurring. And I think that's something that really begins to become quite powerful. And it's from that point onward that you have the self-conscious attempts periodically to construct traditions, to kind of, you know, almost instrumentally to kind of create traditions, because the organic relationship is no longer there, especially when, you know, the interpreters of tradition, which used to be the church, no longer play that kind of a role. It was a very distinct set of lectures that Foucault gave. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Foucault, but he gives some wonderful lectures on this period where he makes the point, he talks about what he calls the pastoral, the way in which at a certain point the pastoral role that the church used to provide in relation to tradition gets gradually incorporated by the state at that particular time. And I think that kind of, he's one of the few sociologists, historical sociologists that have really grasped that particular kind of dynamic. On the relationship between Descartes and the Reformation, I'm not sure about the relationship between Descartes and his attempt to sort of reconcile his own faith with the new sciences and the other subject. But the one Catholic theologian that does try to do that, and in fact, it's not really all that well known in the English language. There's a Jesuit, a Spanish Jesuit called Suarez, you know, the Liverpool same thing, who's the first person to invent the social contract idea. I think he's the first person to try to somehow kind of develop this new idea where there's a relationship between consent and authority. And I think what's interesting about the period is that both the Spanish Jesuits and the French Huguenots, who are both in the forefront of developing ideas about the resistance, are doing it for very opportunistic reasons. Because basically the way that it worked, if you were a Protestant in France, then you would, you know, buy into resistance theory if the king was Catholic. But if you were a Catholic in England and the king was Protestant, then you would also find your way around a good argument as to why that king should be resisted. But if you were, you know, Protestant in England, then of course, you know, divine rule prevails. That couldn't be questioned. And what we're seeing at that point is a very kind of pragmatic turn of politics and philosophy. And I think what Descartes is doing, and then later on after Descartes, with the 17th century kind of skeptics, a very kind of pragmatic orientation towards all the really important philosophical questions.
And just to add in terms of the challenges to tradition, it's interesting to note that while the separation between political rule and moral authority was a novel thing in terms of actually being challenged, it was right there in Scripture. So you could go back to the Old Testament and the accounts of lots of very bad kings, political rulers with no moral authority, and foreign powers dominating the Jewish people. And this was seen as God testing or punishing the people very clearly, that these were immoral rulers, but yet they had to obey. And there was this distinct moral voice of the prophets, the distinction between the kings who were mostly terrible and the prophets who had the word of God. So that had been there all along. But obviously when people start to read it, and some of the material changes that Frank were talking about meant that the context was very different. But when we talk about the importance of Scripture, it's quite a good book. It's worth looking at. And stuff in there. Angus, and then can I see anyone else wants?
Well, actually, sort of following on from that, because rulers always do tend to do terrible things, and it's the question about sin and evil, I suppose. So Luther seems to give no freedom. You're powerless in the post-fall world to choose good or evil. That's out of your hands. Good with a capital G. That's out of your hands. Faith alone matters there. But as you said, Frank, in the secular world, you can do what you want. But what you always do, because you are by nature sinful, is choose sin. This certainly comes out in Calvin. So you have freedom in the secular world, but it's only a freedom to sin. You will always choose evil, and that's, I suppose, why they're concerned about what you do with rulers who always do evil things to you. But what kind of freedom is that? I mean, is choosing evil just a theological way of describing freedom? You have to talk about it in that way because of the religious character of intellectual thought at the time, or does evil sort of enter the world in a way that hadn't been there before? I mean, we do have a century of horrible wars and people killing themselves all through the peasants and so on, massacres, and it's not been great since in some ways. So I'm not sure if it's a question. I'm just kind of wondering about that, but I maybe raise it because I know it will come up later on. But what do you think about the emergence of sin and evil at that point?
Okay, we've got less than 10 minutes, so try and keep them short, and probably won't get everyone in, but who's got the microphone now? Yeah.
Hi, Jake Harford. I was just wondering what kind of about your way you treat the book and reading, at least with Luther. It always seems like you idolise that the democratic part of the argument. You make the point about can you please the book? And the fact is, at least in the early modern period, there is a lot of these things. They're not encountering books outside of the cultural context. Like I think of the work of Stanley Fish. People read in interpretive communities that all kind of say there's a correct way of reading the text, a correct way of interpreting the Bible. They have commentary on them. And even the work of Mackenzie in the sociology of text, he's all seem to say that the book isn't as free as you seem to be saying that it is. Like they read the Bible and suddenly they have this inner freedom, but I'm not quite sure if that really is. I think that's an exaggeration of what is going on in the early period, at least. So I was wondering if you could comment on on readership and how the different ways in which reading was then
okay.
Now.
Yeah, would you pass the microphone forward?
I'm Simon Parsons. I've just got a couple of medievalist points to kind of bring into the whole debate. Talk about precedents again. We talk about consent and authority. And John of Salisbury, writing in the 1150s, talks an awful lot about how authority derives entirely from consent, about the ability kind of based on biblical ideas of remove kings, etc. That's quite interesting. And also precedent to Luther in a way, with the refusal to respect the authority of the papacy in favour of individual conscience. Looking at things like the Bogomil and Cathar heresies is very interesting. They've got a lot of interesting thought on that sort of area. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts about the kind of medieval period kind of leading up into the Reformation.
Okay, thanks. Keep it coming forward.
Peter Lloyd, my question is going to be the same thing. I'll just expand it. On the Cathars, isn't that a dualism tradition that was going on elsewhere, springing up? Isn't that a good example of a society that was living by completely different rules with the dualism that's been probably well described?
Okay, we pass one to the end, and then one more at the front, and that's going to be it.
Yeah, I wanted you to, I'm interested in what you said about Luther being an opportunist. Because certainly when, especially the non-German humanists turned their back on him, I can see why he needed the princes and therefore, supported the princes against the revolt by the Serbs. But Marcuse in his book kind of looks at the secular world and says that Luther believed that God kind of ordained you as who you are. It kind of makes this when you are a child, you're a father, your father or your Lord. And in that sense, even when when Christians were taken over by Turks, he was asking the Christians not to rebel because he kind of believed that you are in your place as it is, which kind of, in one sense, you could say goes a little bit against the grain of opportunism, although I can see exactly why, he would have wanted the princes to back him, and therefore I understand why that terrain of events happened. But I just wanted you to comment a little bit on what Marcuse had to say about it.
Okay, thanks. Would you pass it right to the front?
Where?
At the front. And apologies to anyone who can't get in. If you can make a question about Kant, you can speak in the evening.
It's probably wrong to do this because you said we shouldn't do this discussion later, but when you sort of suggested the seed of the therapeutic self lay in this moment, I got carried away with that idea. But the question is, I mean, I always find it difficult to comprehend belief as a mechanism through developing knowledge and understanding and reason. I find it quite hard to sort of get my head around that. The thing that, from what you're saying at the moment, if you think about the realm of the personal conscience at this point, the thing that I find very difficult to understand is whether this is a process of thinking or feeling. When you talk about belief in that context, would they make a distinction at this point, historically, between to feel or to think? Because I associate feeling with therapeutic self and thinking with reason.
Okay. Well, on that last question, yeah, I mean, that goes back a long time when you have a kind of conceptual distinction that is drawn between the two. Although the status that is given to reasoning is, and what is meant by reasoning, is different than obviously than in modern times. On the medieval question, I mean, I think sort of there are. I mean, somebody mentioned John Salisbury of early forms of medieval political theorists who outwardly are raising some very important questions, and I think that's even greater, more the case with the time of the conciliar movement, when you have people like Ockham and Marcel Padua are all, raising some very fundamental questions. But what I would suggest is that the questions that they pose are still framed within, for lack of a better expression, a medieval problematic. It's still within the context of the kind of prevailing sort of middle-age related norms. And it's what we're seeing here is you can go through a lot of the sort of text of the 14th, 15th century, particularly the 15th century, where a lot of big questions are being raised, but they are sort of creating the intellectual precondition for the kind of developments that will take place within Reformation. And I know there is now an argument which basically suggests that there is within the medieval era Reformation itself at an earlier stage, where you have sort of some of these kind of issues being kind of raised. But I'm not sure how useful it is to track things back too far, because the logic of that is that we end up tracking things back to ancient Greece and not really see the distinct elements of a particular period. On the question of readership, I think readership depends on context. It depends very much on the cultural and intellectual climate. And I think that the kind of skeptical cynicism of someone like Stanley Fish towards reading in America at a particular time, it is very much to do with the privileged position that intellectuals have at that particular moment in relation to their personal life, their security, their tenure at a university, the way that, in a sense, their life has become phenomenally estranged and distant from the concerns of normal human beings in a way that actually wasn't the case at that particular stage. I mean, the scholastic tradition, for all its sins, had a slightly more interrelationship with the world than some academics have today, as did the monasteries in those days. They were much more, unless you were completely cut off, they were much more in tune with what was going on in the world. I think that the book cannot be, I mean, the importance of the book as a tool, as a means for developing human consciousness and developing subjectivity and cultivating a sense of possibilities cannot be overemphasized. And I think that one of the things that we've learned is that you cannot force people to read according to one script, and that people, you know, sort of in their relationship to the text, do find ways and means of transcending the immediate environment that they're in. One thing I'll never forget, even from my own personal experience, as a 9-year-old, 8.5, 9-year-old, growing up in Hungary, and seeing in 1956 people reading books everywhere. Everywhere I went, people are reading books. And as they're reading the books, you find that a month later, in May, June 1956, all the university students are kind of clandestinely handing out leaflets and books and publishing newspapers. And I remember that moment. I remember in September 1956, my father telling me, we need to get our hands on those newspapers. Could you go out and get it for us? I go with my sister in the middle of the night, where the kids are handing out the newspapers and the books, and you know, nobody wanted to give theirs up. You know, nobody, you know, this is fuck off, basically, what they were saying. You know, Hungarian is 35 years saying the same thing. You know, nobody wanted to kind of give it up, and within a month, there's a revolution occurring. Now, the reason why there's a revolution isn't because of the books, but because of the context and the interrelationship between the books and everything else, which is very different than in 21st century England, where you can go to, you know, Waterstones and bookshop, and you go in there, and there are, you know, what are the books that people are buying? Well, they're Jamie Cook on this cooking, and that celebrity chef, and you got all the, you know, all the kind of piled up, what's this, 50 Shades of whatever. all the stuff that you have permission to kind of read. And then you can draw the Stanley Fish kind of conclusions, where you have this, you know, sort of extremely cynical relationship to the written word. It depends on the context, and it's very easy to get cynical, but at the same time you have to understand that in a certain circumstances, there is a different relationship that's totally different. I mean, that's why the existentialist discussion on Monday will be quite interesting, because, I mean, Sartre, you can imagine Sartre and his friends in 1940 France, you know, they're getting their asses kicked in by the Germans. You know, what do? You sit down with your friends, you read, you philosophize, and the meaning that those ideas have in those circumstances becomes very, very different. And I think that it's in that context that the Reformation is going to be seen, because the printing press and the publication of the books does create a dynamic where bit by bit more and more people are able to have their intellectual, you know, sort of curiosity cultivated by a force that is outside of themselves. And I think if you read the historical accounts, if you read some of the novels and the literatures of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, what you find is an incredible process of clarification occurring, very much against the grain of times. And I think that's really where even sometimes the worst books with the worst ideas end up having the unintended consequences of opening that crack a little bit more.